husband's phone buzzed while he was showering, and I saw a text from someone named the Queen that said, "Can't wait for this weekend, King." The thing is, my husband Gregory was the most predictable man on the planet, and that's exactly why I married him. He'd worked as an accountant at the same firm for 12 years. He ordered the same turkey club from the same deli every single day at exactly noon, and he took me to the restaurant he proposed at every single anniversary without fail. Date nights were always the same Italian restaurant where he always ordered the chicken parm. Vacations were always the same resort in Cancun, where he always picked the same room on the 3rd floor, and even our arguments were boring because he'd just agree with me to avoid conflict. Gregory was the kind of man who set his alarm for 6:15 every morning, even on weekends, because he said sleeping in made him feel disoriented, and he wore the same rotation of 5 polo shirts to work, because he said it eliminated decision fatigue. His idea of a wild Friday night was staying up past 10 to watch a documentary about bridges, and one time he got genuinely excited because our grocery store rearranged the cereal aisle, and he called it an adventure. He didn't watch sports, he didn't go to bars, and the most spontaneous thing he'd ever done in our entire marriage was order a different flavor of ice cream at the grocery store one time, and then put it back because he said he wasn't sure about it. So when Gregory suddenly started working late every Thursday, and spending entire Saturdays at team building exercises that he could never quite explain in detail, I knew something was wrong immediately, because this man had never deviated from his routine for anything in the entire decade I'd known him. The first thing I noticed was the stains. Gregory would come home on Saturdays with these dark reddish smears on his collar that looked exactly like lipstick, and when I confronted him about it, he got all flustered and stammered out, "Oh, that's just from the trust fall exercises, someone's face hit my shoulder," which didn't even make sense because trust falls don't involve your neck. Then he started doing his own laundry for the first time in our entire marriage, and when I asked why he was suddenly so interested in household chores, he said he was trying to be more helpful around the house, which would have been sweet if it wasn't so obviously suspicious coming from a man who had never once voluntarily touched the washing machine. I found a receipt crumpled up in his jacket pocket for $400 from a place called In the Night, and when I asked him about it, he said it was a work expense for office supplies, and changed the subject so fast I barely had time to process what he'd said. The Thursday nights got worse too because he started coming home later and later, sometimes not until almost midnight, and he always looked exhausted in a way that was different from his normal tired because he'd be flushed and out of breath like he'd been doing something physical. I tried to get him to talk about it one night and sat him down at the kitchen table and asked him directly if there was something going on that he needed to tell me, and he looked me dead in the eyes and said, "Honey, I promise you there is nothing to worry about. I am just very committed to being a team player at work." And then he winced when he sat down because his entire back was apparently covered in bruises. Then the scratches started showing up on his arms, long red marks that looked like someone had clawed him, and one Thursday he came home with a massive bruise on his ribs that had already started turning purple. I asked him what happened, and he told me with a completely straight face that he tripped on the rug while he was rushing to the fax machine at work, and I just stared at him because nobody in the year 2024 is rushing to a fax machine for anything. That's when I knew my husband was completely full of it, and whatever he was hiding was something he desperately didn't want me to find out about. I started paying closer attention to everything, and noticed that he'd changed the password on his phone for the first time ever, and when I casually asked him why he said his company required stronger security, which was hilarious coming from a man whose previous password was literally the word password, followed by the number 1. I also noticed he'd been getting packages delivered to the house while I was at work, because I found shipping labels in the recycling bin from companies I'd never heard of with names that sounded like costume shops or prop stores, and when I brought it up, he said his coworker was using our address for personal deliveries, which was the weakest lie he'd told yet. One night I walked past the garage and heard what sounded like metal clanking together, and when I opened the door, Gregory was standing there looking guilty next to a giant duffel bag that he zipped shut so fast he almost caught his finger in it, and told me he was organizing old camping gear, even though we had never been camping a single day in our lives. The final straw came on a Saturday morning when I watched him get dressed and he put on athletic clothes instead of his usual khakis, threw a giant duffel bag in the trunk of his car that I'd never seen before, and told me he'd be at team building until dinner. I checked his location sharing that he'd always kept on because Gregory was not the kind of man who had anything to hide, and I watched his little blue dot drive 40 minutes outside of town, past the suburbs and past the office parks to some random county park in the middle of nowhere. I grabbed my keys and got in my car and followed him because I needed to see whoever this queen was with my own eyes, and I needed Gregory to look me in the face and explain why the most boring man alive was suddenly living a double life. I followed his GPS dot down a 2-lane road that turned into a gravel path that led into the parking lot of this random county park that I didn't even know existed, and the parking lot was completely packed with cars, which already didn't make sense for a Saturday morning at a park in the middle of nowhere. I parked at the far end of the lot and started walking toward the main field area because I could hear noise coming from that direction, and the closer I got, the louder it became until it sounded like a full crowd of people shouting over each other. I came around the tree line into the open field, and I completely froze in place because there were at least 150 people dressed in full medieval costumes, absolutely wailing on each other with foam swords in broad daylight like their lives depended on it. There were knights in actual suits of armor swinging massive foam weapons at each other, people in flowing robes waving fake wands and shouting spells at the top of their lungs, archers with foam-tipped arrows firing into the crowd, and someone was literally riding a horse in a full suit of chainmail, while a group of people dressed as peasants ran screaming in the other direction. There were actual catapults on both sides of the field launching foam boulders across the grass that were exploding into pieces on impact, and people were throwing themselves to the ground dramatically every time they got hit like they were starring in their own personal action movie. There were referees walking around in black and white striped tunics making calls like, "You've been slain, take a knee," and people were actually arguing about whether a foam arrow had technically hit them or just grazed their shoulder pad. Most of the fighters had these dramatic red streaks painted across their faces and necks like warrior marks, and the ones who had been fighting the longest had the paint smeared all down their collars from sweating through their battles, which suddenly explained every single stain I'd ever found on Gregory's shirts. A woman in a full Viking helmet helmet sprinted past me screaming, "For the Northern Alliance!" and shoulder-checked a guy in a cape so hard he flew sideways into a hay bale, and I just stood there with my mouth hanging open, because I had driven out here expecting to catch my husband with another woman, and instead I had apparently stumbled into a full-scale medieval war. I watched these people fight for what felt like an eternity, because I genuinely could not process what I was seeing, and the longer I stood there, the more elaborate I realized the whole thing was because there were banners and flags planted all over the field representing different kingdoms, medical tents where people were getting their face paint reapplied, and a whole section that looked like a medieval marketplace where people were trading foam weapons and pieces of armor between battles, while a guy in a jester costume juggled actual flaming torches, and a woman painted to look like a dragon posed for pictures with people's kids. Then a trumpet blasted so loud it echoed across the entire field, and every single person immediately stopped fighting and dropped to one knee facing this massive decorated tent at the far end of the field that I somehow hadn't noticed until that moment. The crowd of 150 warriors went completely silent, and then they started chanting in unison, "Long live the king, long live the king," and the chanting got louder and louder until the flaps of the tent flew open, and a man in the most elaborate golden armor I had ever seen stepped out wearing a red velvet cape that dragged behind him and a crown that actually glinted in the sunlight. A woman standing next to me who was dressed as some kind of elf grabbed my arm and whispered, "That's King Gregorian the Unbroken. He's led our kingdom for 3 years, and he has never lost a single battle." And I felt my entire brain short-circuit because she had just said the name Gregorian. The king raised a massive foam sword above his head, and the crowd roared so loud I could feel it in my chest. And then he shouted in this booming voice I had never heard before in my life, "Today we have defended our realm once more, and our enemies shall tremble at the mere whisper of our name." And every single person on that field went absolutely insane, cheering and banging their weapons against their shields. I was already standing there feeling like I had somehow fallen into an alternate dimension, and then King Gregorian the Unbroken reached up with both hands and slowly removed his helmet, and I actually screamed out loud because it was Gregory. It was my Gregory, my boring accountant husband who couldn't even decide what to order at Chipotle without asking me twice, standing there in golden armor with war paint streaked across his face looking like the most confident and powerful person I had ever seen in my entire life, while 150 people chanted his name like he was an actual king. Gregory's eyes found mine across that field, and he didn't look embarrassed or caught or guilty at all, and instead he just stood there looking at me with this expression I'd never seen on his face before, like he was finally letting me see who he actually was. He walked over to me still wearing the full armor and cape and crown while 100 people watched, and he said, "I wanted to tell you, but I didn't know how to explain that your husband runs a medieval kingdom on the weekends, and honestly I couldn't even be mad because I had spent weeks convinced he was having an affair, and instead he was leading an army of nerds into foam combat as an undefeated warrior king." The woman who had texted him turned out to be a 62-year-old retired teacher named Brenda, who played the kingdom's sorceress, and had been helping Gregory plan a surprise ceremony to officially crown me as his queen in front of the entire kingdom. He taught me to wield a foam sword that summer, and I am now a general in the Gregorian kingdom with my own suit of armor, and a title he gave me on our anniversary, the Queen.